I don't encourage like a judgmental, hard stance that's punitive. A relationship and connection is what people listen to. And then I, as a person who's lived this and had been there, when people ask me what would have reached you, it always comes down to a non-judgmental conversation with a fellow concerned Christian. Not somebody taking me to coffee so they can shame or scold me. Somebody who's actually invested in my life, who sees a warning sign and wants to help me improve it.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Ryan George, Janai Aman, and Sharon Hottie Miller. You go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Tia Levings. Tia Levings writes about the realities in Christian fundamentalism, evangelical patriarchy, and religious trauma. She's also a podcaster, speaker, and content strategist. She's been quoted in Salon, The Huffington Post, and Newsweek, and appeared in the hit Amazon docuseries, Shiny, Happy People. Based in Jacksonville, Florida, she is a mom to 4 incredible adults and likes to travel, hike, paint, and daydream. Her memoir, A Well-Trained Wife, is out now. In this episode, Tia Levings provides a powerful and insightful look into the realities of Christian fundamentalism and patriarchy, and the devastating impact it can have on individuals and families. She shares her personal story of growing up in a high-control religious environment and her eventual escape from an abusive marriage. Her experiences shed light on the dangers of rigid ideologies that value ideas over people and the critical need for compassion, discernment, and support for those trapped in such systems. Tia shares important lessons for recognizing and addressing the rise of extremism in our culture and the importance of fostering an expansive, loving, and life-giving faith. Here is my conversation with Tia Levings. Tia, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd love to start to get into some of your story. Your story is about abuse, fundamentalism, religious trauma and abuse, mental health issues, and trying to escape Christian patriarchy. There's all sorts of crazy things that happened in your story, and I'm sorry about what happened because it shouldn't happen to anybody. But before we jump into the story, just to set us up as a framework of what we're talking about, can we talk a little bit about fundamentalism and where you came from and what fundamentalism is?
Yeah, so I always start at the top and let people know that I grew up in the largest Southern megachurch in the country at the time. So First Baptist Jacksonville rivals First Baptist Dallas. My pastor was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so it's very mainstream, normal, evangelical, typical upbringing. The church was becoming more fundamentalist as I grew up. And so when I use the word fundamentalism, I'm really careful to remind people that fundamentalism and that kind of binary thinking can be in anything. It is not necessarily religious. I know there is a denomination that calls themselves the fundamentalists, and I want to have a distinction against that. My definition of fundamentalism is any time that there is an ideal and a promise that is achieved through a formula, and that if you follow the steps of this formula, you will definitely get this result. And so that can really be in anything, and it does show up in anything. When I talk about Christian fundamentalism, it's because I was living in that environment where we were sold promises and we were told that if we do these things, which became an ever expansive list of things we had to do, we would definitely get this result. And the opposite was true. So that I look today to be as unfundamentalist as possible in every area of my life.
So then, okay, before we jump into some of the things in your childhood, what does unfundamentalist in your life look like right now?
Yeah, it looks like curiosity. It looks like believing in a really big God that can do anything, like truly anything. Fundamentalism is very binary and rigid, and it tends to put things in boxes. So being anti-fundamentalist means that you're expansive. You believe in an expansive society that is continuing to grow in love and understanding and compassion. And so I try to apply that to everything that I do, not just because it's a good way to live and it's a healthy, life-giving way to be, but it is also against all of the smallness and prison-like rigidity that I found myself in during my first marriage.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because that brings life and flourishing, and that leads to an expansive life that can actually bring health and wholeness, goodness.
Yeah.
So I love that you actually have gotten to that place in your life. So how did you get to this place? Like, you talk at the very beginning of your book, you went through the place of what it looks like as grooming somebody into a place of fundamentalism, of following this formula, following these rules, getting to this one place, then you're going to achieve a certain type of result. What were you seeking as a child that walked you down the path of the formula?
Yeah, I think it's something that everybody can relate to. I wanted to have a happy life, a happy marriage, a happy family. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to please God. I wanted to please the people around me. I really bought into the Christian princess mindset that if I remained pure and was not sexually active as a teenager, if I was a virgin bride, if I followed all the rules that we were taught for a wholesome life, that it would result in this happily ever after. They weren't really preparing us for that. Now I know this as a parent and as a survivor, because there was no like actual structural education or, how to recognize a warning sign, what to do if you're in trouble. There was none of that. It was all very romanticized and idealized. So what I was looking for was just happiness and security, safety, wholeness. It's the things that always draw us to fundamentalism, because fundamentalism offers you a structure when there's chaos and fear. And so it's always a balm. It's always I think a very human desire when we go towards rigid structure. We're looking for comfort.
So what was chaotic for you? What were you fearing?
Yeah, the world in general, this was pre 9/11, but it was very similar politics to what we face today. So it was always very scary. First Baptist was very much I think the evangelical movement on the whole was beginning to craft this Christianity that was an America within an America. So within my bubble was very safe, as long as I went to church 6 and 7 days a week. And as I only watched Christian media and I only hung around other Christians, I was fine. But as soon as I stepped a foot out of the world, my worldview was not preparing me for a diverse experience on the planet. So I was scared of all of it. I was scared to leave my little world that they had created for me. Chaos seemed to be in the world of sin. I didn't know how to navigate those waters. So it just all seemed like chaos to me. And the idea of one partner for life, that in our church, we didn't know our partners very well when we first got married, because we were very much encouraged to have quick engagements so that we would stay sexually pure. That terrified me, that I only had one shot to get it right. This was my partner for life and there was no way out. And so I personally was very terrified that I would get it wrong. And I didn't have any real criteria for getting it right other than God was supposed to protect me, that I didn't need to worry about it. It would be okay.
What were some of the things that you were hearing at that time growing up that led you down to a place of like, I need to control this, or I need others to control this like romantic, idealized version of things so that I could have the good life. What were some of the things that were said from the pulpit or from friends or from other adults that were around you?
Yeah, I was just in a conversation yesterday where I was trying to describe how the message is really layered upon one another, so that what we heard on Sunday was compatible with what we were hearing in Sunday school, in our families, in our homes, our Bible clubs. Like, there was no place we didn't go where we weren't hearing the same messaging over and over and over again. And coming from a wealthy megachurch, we had a lot of resources. So we did a lot of fun things like ski trips and tours and all the good things. Like, it was, in one way, it was a very blessed, privileged way to grow up. And it was hard to deconstruct it afterward, too, because I'd had so many good memories in church. But the messaging, I have very graphic pastors, and I know that there's a style of preaching that is very, very graphic. So I was hearing explicit fear tactics from the pulpit about sexually transmitted diseases, the homosexual lifestyle, lesbians, women who don't want children, the big bad Democrats. I mean, it was always graphic and screamed and tied to hell and eternal damnation, and politicized gradually. As I grew up, we became more political as a congregation. And so they were everywhere. I knew I couldn't watch TV without being tempted, and there was no discernment being taught. It was vilification. So the blacks and white issues, were just very stark.
Well, then what does that look like to actually then teach discernment instead of just rail against what is wrong or what people think is wrong? They're saying, it's just fear. There's something evil out there. You need to stay here and we'll keep you safe. So what does then discernment look like? How then, if you weren't taught that as a child growing up, how can we start to teach children growing up some discernment instead of fear tactics, what we're against, but we could actually discern how to live in the world?
Yeah, and I have experience with this because I raised my children after my escape differently than I grew up, and so I got to practice this on the street, with my teenagers, and going through similar things that I went through as a kid. So it was all very relatable. But discernment I taught through actual dialogue. I taught, my favorite scripture is to be fruit inspectors. So if we're really looking at the fruit of an idea and what it produces, that can help us a lot in discerning if it's the way to go. I can't remember a time in my life where the end example was allowed to be scrutinized. We had very few success stories that were actually provided, because if a generation went wrong, they would just shift to the next youthful generation or the next shining example. And then we weren't allowed to hear from the disenfranchised and the people who left the congregation and why they left. They were just cut off and shunned. So when I was teaching my kids discernment, I was like, listen to the survivors of an ideology and hear what they're having to say. And you don't have to listen with like full agreement. You can listen and hold it against what's being promised and do your own research on this. This was before do your own research was like a hashtag. But I taught them, hold two things, hold mutual truths in your hands and weigh them. I don't think we're taught, certainly in fundamentalism, we're not taught to weigh multiple truths and let two things be true at the same time. And so when you're painting with extremes, it's all bad or it's all good. That's a big red flag that you're in a binary situation.
All Nations Kansas City has two exciting events with Jamie and Donna Winship coming up. Join us on September 13th for our annual fundraiser, Further Together, with Jamie and Donna as our main speakers. Did you know that God is on the move all around the world? You will hear stories about people receiving their true identity from God and impacting nations. And you will be invited to join us so that more stories like these can happen and we can see peace in the midst of conflict. The following day, September 14th, Jamie and Donna will be doing their identity exchange workshop. Join us to discover your true identity and experience a life of joy, peace, and freedom. You can register for both events at allnations.us. Well, that's helpful. Take me into a place where, so I grew up in a church where this didn't happen. Like I was very thankful, like reading your book, I'm like, and knowing that it wasn't actually that fringe at times. Like there's some mainstream things happening in the evangelical church, and that was happening there. But it was foreign to me. But usually when I started to see some of this happen, I basically said, those are just some silly people over there. And I ignore it. So for somebody like me, when things do pop up, I'm not in that situation. Is there anything that people on the outside can do for people caught up in fundamentalism and this binary way of thinking that leads to a constriction of life and not to an abundant life? What can people from the outside do to help people on the inside of that?
I love that question, specifically because in our congregations, so in my story, the Bill Gothard's Institute of Basic Life Principles came in and kind of took over our church. And then we left as a group and we completely cannibalized another congregation. And so the way that Bill Gothard's evangelism method worked was that he would draw these people to these conventions and they would study the biblical principles, not denominational. So it was coming from all kinds of different groups. And these were the people who wanted a little extra in their life. You know, they wanted to be very devout Christians. And so they spend their money and their vacation time and they take their families and they go to these conferences. And then they come back into their congregations and they recruit from within. So your question set it up perfectly, because now we have a situation where we have those weird people, those silly people. We have those, why do they have so many children? Why are they dressed that way? Why are they so serious and devout? And that tension did a lot of things in our congregation. This was about a 12-year period where we could observe them. We could see them spreading. They were forming groups, and plenty of bystanders just ignored it. They held it with a certain regard because it was devotion that they weren't willing to do themselves, but they were like, look at these almost monastic Christians. They're doing so great. Let's give them cars. You know, like the wealthy people in our congregation would give them cars and give them houses and help them actually live this lifestyle instead of paying attention to the children, what's happening there, what are these neglects that are going on. And so this is a hot button for me, because those kids and those families are already isolated from every mandatory reporter they could possibly access, except when they go to a church. And so when they're at a church and they're not, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the family integrated church movement, but this was rising in congregations. And so parents were taking their kids out of Sunday school and the nursery so that they could sit together as a family. And then eventually they would leave in home church. But there was this window of time where they just weren't engaging in all of the church programs. They were deciding to sit as a family so that the husband could be the head of the spiritual instruction. And so those kids were no longer even with Sunday school teachers, but they were still somewhat visible. So to answer your question, what people can do is pay attention, don't look the other way, try to make friendships and engage, and keep your eyes peeled for signs of neglect, signs of abuse, dialogue. You know, I don't encourage like a judgmental, hard stance that's punitive. You know, a relationship and connection is what people listen to. And then I, as a person who's lived this and had been there, when people ask me what would have reached you, it always comes down to a non-judgmental conversation with a fellow concerned Christian. Not somebody taking me to coffee so they can shame or scold me. Somebody who's actually invested in my life, who sees a warning sign and wants to help me improve it. You know, I think there's so much power in churches for that, because they are there. Everybody knows the weird Christians in their church.
Yeah. So then how do I take somebody to coffee and have that non-judgmental, non-anxious presence, the questions, the curiosity, in a way that is not judgmental and shameful, because that usually shuts people down. So how do you have that conversation? What does the nuance of that look like when you say, hey, I'm kind of concerned about you. What's the nuance there for us?
Yeah, I think it's maybe not take them for coffee, take them for some sort of active part of their life. So I don't know how familiar you are, but on the outside, take them for coffee is code for you're about to get in trouble. it is a red flag to religious trauma survivors. And there's a lot of stories about that. But there are other ways to interact with somebody in their day-to-day life and be neighborly, such as I know that there were concerned congregants who took some quiverful children clothes shopping. And they bought the clothes that they wanted according to their hyper modesty standards, but they still helped spend time talking. Like, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to do this with you, alongside you. I'm going to not step on your values, but I'm going to take some of your burden, bear some of your burden, and keep the dialogue open. You know, you might not see a tangible, immediate response, but you've planted a seed of, I know I can trust them. I know they'll be for me, there for me when I'm ready to make a change, because you can't coerce change. You can't, that doesn't really work.
That's good. And knowing that there's somebody there, like when you need somebody, when you need to reach out, there's somebody there that you can go to, that will be that person for you. I think that's helpful. That's really good. So take me into your story of, the first time you're meeting your first husband. What were you feeling? And as you were having your engagement, getting ready to be married, what was the premarital counseling look like? What was this whole relationship look like?
Yeah. I was kind of on a mission because I knew my job was to be a Christian wife and mother, and I was a year out of high school and I was getting stale. And that tells you a lot about the environment I was in.
That tells me a whole lot, yes.
Yes, I was not supposed to go to college unless it was to find a husband, and I didn't go to college because of money, which was a heartbreak for me. And so I also wasn't dating because the courtship model was starting to become part of the conversation, but I just wasn't also dating. Like, it just, I think I was a fire spirit, and people didn't know what to do with me. And so I did get a few little dates before I met him, but they didn't go well, over quickly. And so I felt this enormous pressure of, like, if I'm going to fulfill my God-given destiny to be a Christian wife and mother, which I wanted for myself, this was not put on me, then I got to have a guy. And so I was really open to what I'd been taught to expect, is that God's man, God's best for me, will show up in my life, and he will announce himself that he is God's best. And my job is to accept God's best. There was no talk about compatibility or chemistry, or if you're really interested in him. Your job as an obedient Christian girl is to accept what God has provided for you. And so also my pastors both had 2-week engagements, and they preached that often. So, like, the idea of a meet them and quickly get engaged was very popular. We had weddings every Friday. It was a big deal. And so this churn of all these marriages, it was very quick. So I met him at the beginning of December of 93. We were engaged a month later, and we were married the following year, within that year. It was already violent, but I didn't have any language for comprehending what violence was or what it looked like. So I was just trying to work with what God gave me. I was trying to convince myself that I was attracted to him. I was excited, and I told myself I was in love because I had never had those feelings before. Young, optimistic, can-do spirit. I come from people who can work with what's given, like, we're resourceful people. So I felt like I really approached it like, all right, God, let's roll up my sleeves and we'll figure this out and we'll make it work. And I thought I was being really obedient and good.
So even in that spot, well, at least one person, your premarital counselor, said, "Hey, you guys are probably not a good match."
We failed the test.
You failed the test.
We failed the test.
Yeah, there's not enough room for the two lights here, right? And there were some warning signs for you, right? There was violence already. There was manipulation and control that was happening, in the engagement process as well. When there are stars in your eyes, I've told, people that are going to get married, it's really difficult, like, for anybody to say, this is probably not a good match. You should probably go separate ways. It doesn't really work out very much when you say that.
Right.
And I'm very thankful that it did happen with my wife. Her first engagement, she called it off a month before her wedding, and then she found me. So that was great. So she's
Such
very
courage.
thankful. And she had people in her life that said, after her fiance at the time, something happened, and she had a friend and a mentor that said, you don't have to marry him. And, and she said, okay, there is permission here where I can call it off.
That's huge.
Is there a way when other people are seeing some red flags as well? When there are stars in your eyes, when you're young and you feel like you're in love, you want to have this happen for you. Is anything going to work to say, hey, please, no, don't do this?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you breed a culture where there is permission to change your mind, and there are options, and there is support if you change your mind, and people go through life together, experiencing heartache together, and being okay through heartache, like that's a culture-wide issue. And I think, like, I've seen it happen in my children. They had permission to change their mind, and they knew they would be disappointed in heartache through that, but they also knew they would be supported and loved through that heartache, and that it would be okay. They would come out on the other side. And that knowledge that you'll be okay on the other side of heartache is part of being a teenager. It's part of being an adolescent and growing up. And you'll do it in adulthood. You do it eventually. Eventually you get to a point where you have to go through real heartache, and you have to find out that you're okay on the other side. I do think that can be part of church change.
So as your first husband, as he's starting to think through reading a lot of theology books, and getting some information, but with really even more high control religious institutions, and wanting to have control over everything, or actually them telling him that he needs to be the head of the household in all ways, and the spiritual head, that everything flows through him. What did that look like in your marriage? How was he controlling, manipulative? What was happening in that?
Yeah, I think this is a complexity that I'm glad to talk about, because I don't think men are better men for this either. And they're not all villains. They're young boys. So, like, let's just imagine who he is. He's 23. He's newly married. He has a personal bend to love theology. He wants to follow God. He also is looking to his wise older mentors for guidance. This is what he's being told will solve all the chaos in his own heart and life. He had trauma and mental illness, and so there was a lot of internal chaos and disorganization. And so external structure, again, is very familiar and comforting and gives him a way. And big bonus, it's going to bless your God's going to love you more for it. He's going to make you so happy if you do this. Like, it's so tantalizing to think you're going to be blessed of God if you do this hard thing. And it is a hard fit. It's like putting shoes on that don't fit your feet and making yourself walk in them. And it hurts. And when you believe you're going to be blessed on the other side of it, you'll do it anyway, because you're convinced this is going to be good for you. So it affects everything. If you're familiar with the trad movement today, this is a good example of it. Your day-to-day, what's on the table for dinner, who provided it, who goes to work, him inspecting my household, cleaning. He was suddenly responsible to manage me. So he had to go and check my work. He had to make sure it was doing, I'm a very capable person, but he had to go make sure that those things were done correctly, or he's shirking his duty. Like, he felt he would be sinning against God if he wasn't doing those things. And also that control was a go-to reflex for him when he felt out of control, was controlling someone else. So the mashup of violence and high control and disorganization, mental illness, all of it became kind of just a toxic soup that he carried inside of his skin as a very uncomfortable, unhappy person.
So when somebody is feeling out of control, like they want control, so he is there, and he's also dealing with some mental health issues, and they exacerbate later on in your marriage, and they really get to the extreme that it's going to be really bad for you and your family, and it's getting worse and worse. One of the things that I know in our culture is we're very much more aware of mental health issues than we ever have been before.
Yes.
How do we help people spot some of those things? Help people get into some therapy? And I mean, is it even possible? And in a place where it's a high control religion, that there's hierarchy coming from one spot saying, you need to control your household and I'm basically going to control you. And is that even possible to get outside of the bubble, to get some therapy, to go to a place where, hey, you actually need some more help, that this little bubble isn't actually prepared to help?
Yeah, I hope so, because I think this is where Christians need to clean up their house. There's been this rise to new antithetical counseling and biblical counseling. And if we look at the fruit of biblical counseling, it breeds this control. And they're very threatened by external licensure and external resources and psychological evidence. And so when I did turn to a counselor at church and told them everything I was going through, they pointed back to more high control in my life and encouraged more submission and more control. So
I think I was the most angry when that happened. Right there. I was reading your book. I was so angry with it. I was like, that guy, I just wanted to go beat him up. That guy was
the head. He bears a lot of burden. He almost, he would have been responsible, I think, for our lives if the worst had happened. He is the head. I don't know if he still is, but he was at the time the head of a biblical counseling department at a mega church. That's a lot of people, big staff, lots of clients. People who think that they're getting mental health help, but they're not. They're getting steered back into ideology, and they're not allowed outside resources, and they're told those outside resources are threats. So there's no medication. There's no actual, evidence base. There's no accountability. This is an area where Christians can change things, and churches and seminaries and colleges can take back this movement and say, okay, biblical counseling, but be licensed. That would be one step that they could do right there. Would make a big difference. Yeah.
That needs that. I mean, just as a side note, I was just talking to somebody today about ideologies. And I actually think that ideologies are the things that lead us away from being with God and with one another in a way that shows love. And all ideologies do. Like ideologies itself are something that I think actually grab us and hold us and put our attention away from the witness that we are called to be with one another and be with God, and the love that we are called to give. What is that? How is that the ideologies all caught up in with this, the fundamentalist religion, high control religion? What is the ideologies, and how do we then strip away some of the ideologies to know what it actually is to live a good, flourishing life? And because the ideologies actually constrict us into smallness. How do we decipher those
I love
things?
that you put it that way. So I have a quick filter for this. I've spent, this is my life's work. I've spent a lot of time trying to dilute this into a way that I can grab quickly and know in a moment if I'm in the right place or not. And so for me, I say fundamentalism is valuing ideas over people. Anytime, no matter what it is, if the idea is more important than someone's humanity, it is not for me. If I feel a tightness in my chest that I have to perfect or conform or obey or comply or get with a program, it is not for me. Jesus was an individual connecting with individuals, and that is all I'm here for.
In churches, you've been in this place, and they're calling you to obedience. Jesus himself calls us to obedience, but he does it in a way in John 15, in the vine of the branches, says, if you abide in my love, you're actually going to obey my commands. Where you obey my commands, you're going to abide in my love. So love and obedience actually goes together. But I think the church has taken this word obey and have leaned so heavy on rules and regulations, and have actually co-opted their own cultural aspect of how they've grown up and what they want to see, and made obedience into something that is strange and weird and just calls people into that. How do you think, actually, as you've been in the church, now you've been away from that system, the system of that, is there a way for people to actually walk in obedience and love in a place like the church?
I think so. It comes back to fruit. So so this was obedience culture, this really, really was. But again, looking at the fruit of it, and if your standard for Jesus is that he's the way, the truth, and the life, then you go towards fruit that is life-giving, that is illumined, that is expansive, that leads to goodness. If the obedience that you're doing is leading to physical abuse, harm, closed minds, us, them thinking, division, disharmony, violence, you're obeying someone other than Jesus, because that is not the way, the truth, and the life. So I look at what is the outcome here? What's the end result?
So what is Christian patriarchy? And what your book, your subtitle is Your Escape from Christian Patriarchy. Your first husband, it was all like flowing through him. He's the head. What is it? And what are you talking about when you're talking about
I also call it the evangelical patriarchy, because what it is in America right now is not something that it's historically been. Like, for example, the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, those are patriarchal institutions with a man at the head and an authority structure that flows through men. And I have a philosophical issue with those big institutions. That is not what I'm talking about. Evangelical patriarchy in America today in 2024 is a brand of fundamentalism that puts men in like complementarian roles where men can only do leadership in certain things because they have a penis, and women can only do certain things because they have a vagina. And it's a top-down authority structure where women are at home and the lifestyle is super high control, and it takes us really back to puritanical type, and I mean the Puritans coming over to founding fathers type gender roles. It's anti-progress.
I see that, when I read Handmaid's Tale and I watched the series, I was like, that's just an allegory. That can't happen. And I read your book, I was like, oh, I think it's happening.
I call my book the prequel, the real life prequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And it is important to remember that Atwood used real Christian fundamentalist groups as her models. And she's quoted as saying that everything in the book has already happened. She did not make any of those situations up. She did, make an amalgamation, but even in the story, before there was a Gilead, there was an America, and America became a theocracy. And when it becomes a theocracy and Christian patriarchy, this particular brand of Christian patriarchy is in control, you end up with something like Gilead. Project 2025 is a lot like Gilead if it's put into its fruition,
Oh, thanks for that fear.
It's reality. We still have
reality.
Mm-hmm.
If that is reality, which is so scary, where can we start to see things pop up in our culture where like these are the things that you could actually see, like the head coming out of the sand a little bit, poking its head out so that we could say, oh, there it is, because it's hidden a lot and we don't see what is underneath the surface very much. Right. So in all of this world, you actually see a lot of the, as you were in, Shiny Happy People, all the shiny stuff, right? And so how do we start to recognize the stuff that's happening and start to call it out and say, we actually have to live a different way?
Yeah, I really try to take the word from the horse's mouth. So I personally steer away from commentators too much. I don't want to have like a live news cycle in my face. I like to listen to what they're actually saying. And so when I hear politicians or leaders, government leaders, saying things that enforce belief, enforce a certain obedience or compliance to a theological code, for example, putting the 10 Commandments in our public schools, I can hear them say that, and I can hear them preach their reasons for it, and I can know that that doesn't jive with a plural society. That's forced belief. I don't think it's an American belief. I think that's a patriarchal belief. When I read about Project 2025 and the people who actually designed it and drafted it and how long it's been in place for the past 50 years, that's the Heritage Foundation and 110 other conservative think tanks and orgs that have been involved in every presidency since 1973. Those groups are identifiable, and they're also very vocal in their vision for America. They co-opt Christian language because they're trying to pull in, they're trying to pull everyone into this, but it's not Jesus serving. So again, I go back to the fruit and like, well, what is the fruit of their outcome? Who's equal? Who gets rights in that world? Let me have a survivor from that environment and hear their point of view. If there are lots of survivors out from Christian patriarchy, there are more memoirs like me, and it's there. Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, who is a villain in my story, which took place in the early 2000s, still has a huge footprint. It's growing on YouTube, in Idaho, in interconnectedness with other pastors, particularly in Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma. And that's all there. Like if once you start peeling back the layers and identifying the key players, and you can just listen to their own words and see that they don't match the words of Jesus. They don't lead to good way, the truth, and the life.
How do radical ideas of control, high controlling religion, how do those fester into people and people like clamor for them?
Yeah, I really hope this is something that comes through my story. I think that it appeals to the base nature of those who need external control. It's very satisfying to hear that you have this mode of control available to you, and that if you just do these dogmas, that you will, result in this happy streamline. It's easier if everybody just agrees, kind of a thing. He's very bombastic, and so he's good at appealing to that growly side of men, not so much the tender, compassionate human side of men, but the growlier side, the angry side. He knows how to tap into anger. And with women, which the patriarchy does not exist without women. It is huge. They drive this just as much as the men. They're looking for security, safety. They want their own ambitions. They want to have an outlet for their own. Every time you take women out of like equality and put them into a lane and say you're only allowed to do this one thing, you're denying the rest of their talents and gifts and strengths. And so those are going to take and manifest in other ways. And they become narcissistic and manipulative. And the idea that man is the head of the house, but the woman is the neck. Those stories abound too of scary mommies that are ruling the roost. But they're also they're exhausted. They want to come home. They want a simpler life. The aesthetics that are used to sell this are pleasing. Who doesn't love a row full of beautiful children who obey? And the solutions seem easier in a chaotic world. Again, it's the same thing over and over again. So I think Wilson has the recipe down, and he knows how to align with different flavors. Not everybody's like Wilson, but he's got a lot of allies.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. One thing I want to tell you is your book is incredible. It's fantastic. You're an excellent writer. Like this memoir reads like a thriller. It is, high pace. It is wonderful. I just I love your book.
Thank you. I'm self-taught. I had no education. So thank you.
But you did a fantastic job. I'm really, really impressed. So I want people to go out and I want to read your book. Your book is fantastic. And, a spoiler alert, you get out of Christian patriarchy. You get out of, and it does say that on the front cover of your book. So that is, you have spoiled it yourself. So go read that. But what I want to talk about now is that, okay, how'd you get out, and how did you find people to help support you as you were walking out of this situation?
I mean, there's multiple levels that this happened on, of course. My mind that's a longer journey. How my mind started to break free. That's a multiple year journey. And the last year, which was truly hellacious. I mean, if one of my confrontation points was realizing how easy it is to create heaven and hell on earth. We don't necessarily need an afterlife to create those realities for people. And I was living as close to hell as I could have imagined that year. My readiness to leave, I stayed, I think, too long. I have a tendency to stay in situations too long because I'm loyal and believe I can make it better and believe that I have God on my side and all of these things. And so it's been an act of character growth for me to learn to recognize signs earlier and extract myself safely earlier from high control environments. But at that time, I was planning to leave. I had a priest, actually was excommunicated and shunned from our high control Presbyterian church because I started writing about Mary, the Mother of God, and insisted on doing my writing. I was writing a blog that was very well trafficked, and I was using my own name, not my husband's name. and that got me in big trouble with the patriarchy. So I was excommunicated, and then 7 months later, we escaped at midnight under a near murder suicide with my husband. So it was a very physical escape, and there was a priest who was ready to help me. I had been planning to leave the next day. I just didn't get that far. And so that's what it looked like. It looked like one individual being ready to help me, not necessarily agreeing with my whole situation. Like, they didn't know what they were involved in, but he was trying to keep me safe. And that led to his wife hearing my story that morning with my tea. And then I come home, and my parents, who were never patriarchal, they just took their kids to the big church downtown. And they had no idea what we were living in. They took us in. And so it just became this chain of people who were willing to be there for me and help my children and help me acclimate. I had a lot of trauma therapy ahead. I didn't have any language for what I'd experienced. I didn't know what to call what happened to me. An attorney is the first person who called me a battered woman, and I insisted I was not, because I had never been punched in the face. And to my mind, battery meant you were getting black eyes. And my husband was really good at not giving me black eyes. He gave me all kinds of other things. And so I had to go through all this therapy. And so, the beginning of the conversation, you asked me about telling my story without re-traumatizing myself. That's the reflection of 10, 12 years of concerted effort on healing, because I do not accept that condition is going to be my whole life. It took my youth. It took so much from me, but it is not going to take the rest of my life. And so I got really adamant about healing and life and freedom. And then I decided I had to tell my story more widely, because it's coming. This is coming for America now. Like, everything I ran away from is in our headlines. It's terrifying.
It is terrifying. It is. So what is then like working through religious trauma look like? If people have escaped religious trauma, have been traumatized by high control religion, what does the healing part look like?
Yeah. So it's important to remember that religious trauma is trauma. You can take the religious component out of it and just deal with it as trauma, which is going to open a lot of resources to you, because religious trauma as a niche is still finding its feet. And that just means that it's trauma that has a religious component. And it is really helpful if you have a therapist that understands the world you're from and the way your ideas were formed, but it's not essential for healing from trauma. Trauma responses, your fight, flight, freeze, fawn, reflexes, those show up in your life in a habitual way when you've been traumatized. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is that, as well as complex post-traumatic stress syndrome, is what I have. The Body Keeps the Score is a really great book for understanding the physical manifestation that happens in your body, like all the symptoms that you carry and the illnesses that can be caused as a result of having gone through trauma. So having a trauma-informed therapist is big, but I think one of the biggest breakthroughs for me was learning nervous system impact and how to regulate my nervous system, because it's that dysregulation that, if we go way back to the beginning, that inner chaos and dysregulation that makes people crave fundamentalism. So if you can learn to regulate, which I was not taught to do as a child, I was taught to externally depend on others to tell me how I should be regulated. I did not learn any self-development in Christianity. I did not learn any attachment, safe attachment. I was always afraid of the rapture. I was always afraid, So learning to be secure in myself and regulate actually helps me resist fundamentalist ideas, because I don't have to depend on them for stability. I have it within myself now. Which has completely changed my spirituality. It's changed my connection to the divine entirely.
I was talking to a therapist yesterday. I was interviewing a therapist, and we talked about attachment theory and, growing up with secure attachment or avoidant attachments and all sorts of anxious attachment, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And the ability then to figure out how to find yourself and regulate yourself to get home in your body. One of the things that we're talking about, I think, even in your story, one of the things that you said is that you went through a lot of talk therapy for a long time, and that kind of re-traumatized yourself.
Yeah.
But once you started into things like EMDR or different things that got into your body, that helped a lot.
Yeah.
How do we, especially I think in high control religions too, is an intellectual assent more than like living into your body and knowing how to regulate. So what does that look like? What does a embodied experience of trauma care look like?
So in trauma, when you're having a trauma response, like say you're going into fight or flight, freeze or fawn, you have an adrenaline surge through your body, and it's like the chemicals in your body change, the hormones change. So embodiment practices do a lot of things that discharge that, and you can't talk your way out of that discharge. You're going to talk your way, especially if you're a vivid storyteller like I am. I can get really caught up in head space and the story and the events, the timeline of what happened. And that's why it re-traumatizes me, because while I'm telling the story, my heart's racing and my cortisol's rising and I'm having this hormonal, response, and I get sweaty and all those things. So embodiment exercises tone all that down, take the narrative away, and just deal with the feelings that you're having. And so you have to immediately, you just heard my voice probably do it too, immediately come down, slow down, breathe, feel where you're feeling it. Like all of a sudden you can feel your body again. I can feel my thighs. I can feel my chest. I can feel the bottoms of my feet connecting to the floor, and the whole energy electrical current comes down. And so then you're able to soothe and come down to a reasonable, the parts of your brain flick on that where you can think clearly again, you can problem solve, you can think critically, you can assess your danger. Am I really in danger right now? No. But I can talk myself into feeling like I'm in danger real fast. So embodiment brings me back down so I can say, you know what, I'm in a room and I'm calm and I'm having a nice conversation and there's no need for me to be worked up.
I hope that there's some people, if there are any women caught up in things that you are caught up in, and they're listening right now, because this is probably a safe podcast for them to listen to. What would you say to the women who are feeling trapped, feeling like they maybe don't have permission from themselves or others to be able to escape? What would you say to women who are caught up in this?
Yeah, I will promise them first and foremost that all of the fear tactics that were used to keep me in line, like that suggesting I would have no resources out here, that I would be cut off from community, cut off from God, none of that turned out to be true. There has been somebody to help me at every turn. Life is beautiful out here, and it is worth fighting for, and it is worth protecting. If you are a mother in charge of children, you are the only other adult in the room. You have a higher responsibility to stand up for them and advocate for them. It is not just about you. And the idea that divorce is what breaks families is bull. Abuse is what breaks families. So get free however you need to get free. The world is beautiful out here. People will catch you. There's lots of love to go around. People have been suggesting they're going to take my book and take the jacket off of it and hand it covertly. That's hopeful. Someone else said we should make a new jacket that says how to be a trained wife, so that it's allowed in these homes. But each one reach one. It works for freedom too. It's
Yeah, that's good. So for the people who do read your book, what is the hope that you have for them?
Empowerment and knowledge, insight. I want them to be able to better decipher what's happening around them. I want them to be able to see the red flags and build connections between what they've learned in my book and how they're actually hearing those dog whistles out in the wild. I hope it grows compassion. I hope it helps people understand we have a lot more power than we realize. Doesn't necessarily matter what kind of budget Elon Musk throws at oppression. We have a vote, and we at least for this election cycle still have a vote. And how we treat other people is what matters. We're here to connect as human beings. So I hope that that's what comes through more than anything.
As you're seeing more and more of this throughout culture, what's something that we can do to negate that, to live into a different reality, a new way, a different way than what is popping up within our own culture in America?
Yeah.
What's one or two practices that we can do?
Oh, yeah. Ask why. That's always the quickest and easiest. If you hear something, no matter what it is, ask why and explore it, and be willing to at least entertaining your mind the rabbit trail. Like go down and see what others are saying. The other thing is I say, shock your algorithm today. Look at something completely different. Go if you never look at bunnies, look up bunnies. Look up, go to an art museum. Do something that is turn right instead of left. When you're going to the grocery store. Do something that takes you out of your neural pathways, out of your habits, and just shake it up a little bit and see what happens. Because that, entire histories can be changed by a sliding door like that. So it's because we're humans who love the reassurance of a rut. We all love a good rut. So anything you can do to break out of that just a little bit can make a big difference.
There's two quick questions I like to ask at the end. One, I mean, I ask, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Bless her. She's with me so vividly right now. I give her a hug and I hold her hand and I show her that she has permission to change her mind. She will be supported if she leaves. There were people around me who would have helped me. I was just too afraid to ask. I did not know what I did not know.
It's good. Anything that you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Yes, Democracy in Retrograde by Emily Amick is a really good proactive. It's full of ideas for civic engagement, which is very empowering for people who are like, well, what can I do? It's really good for practical steps. It does not attach to a certain camp, so there's no partisan feeling to it. It's just how to be engaged in our civic and responsibilities again, and be community-driven people, which kind of has faded. Civics, I don't even think is taught in schools anymore. So it's a really refreshed book. And yeah, what else am I reading? I mean, I read a lot. I reread Flannery O'Connor's stories again, just because I adore them. And I'm a little bit unsettled at the moment because the racial language that she uses in her 1950s stories is so prevalent today. And so that has actually been very sobering for me to hold. I heard somebody using conversation the exact same reasoning that sounded like a character out of her stories. And I was like, oh, it's just still with us. It's just out loud again. And we have a responsibility to speak against that at every turn.
Yeah, it's good. How could people go out and get your book, A Well-Trained Wife? And where would you like to point people to? How can they connect with you?
Yeah. A Well-Trained Wife is available in hardcover, digital, and audio. I did read it myself. Everyone always asks that. It's available everywhere books are sold as of August 6th. Pre-order now if this airs before August 6th. Afterward, it'll be everywhere. My website is tialevings.com. And my Substack is tialevings.substack.com. And that's where I break down fundamentalist ideas in our headlines, culture, the deconstruction process, family, the whole 9 yards.
Excellent. Well, Tia, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for walking us through a little bit of your story. And I want people to go out and read A Well-Trained Wife. It's an excellent book. And it really helps us see the reality of what we may not see on the outside. On the veneer of the shiny thing that looks weird, but it might be okay and devout. It actually brings us into the reality of the horror of that. And so thank you for your writing and what you did, and then walking us through some of the things that we can look out for and we could see and we could touch and feel, and to help people that are in situations like this. And hopefully our culture can actually veer into a place where it doesn't get more radicalized into the place of high control, where we're losing ourselves and our people, and we're not at a place where we see one another, that we're with one another, that we have, and we move into a place of more expansiveness and more love. So thank you for this. I really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.